Picture this. You are standing beneath the heavy rafters of the Eastern Palace in the year 871, inhaling the sour, sweet drift of sandalwood and rotting lilies. Candles gutter against tall, lacquered screens, shadows dancing like silent witnesses to things better left unseen. The dynasty is old now, frayed by decades of famine, banditry, and endless whispers of betrayal. Once these halls rang with music and laughter. Now they echo with hushed conspiracies and footsteps softened by fear. Before we begin unraveling the cruel heart of this dynasty's final days, if you find value in these forgotten stories of tragedy and power, consider subscribing to hear more. And please share in the comments where in the world you're joining us from. It's remarkable that across centuries and continents, we can gather here to exhume these ghosts together. According to historians specializing in late imperial court culture, the Eastern dynasty in its last century was a kingdom eating itself alive. Records show that as its provinces burned and generals switched loyalties like drifting leaves, the inner court withdrew into layers of ritual and secrecy. Here, in the labyrinth of red-painted doors and curtained corridors, Dowager Empress Lian held dominion like a spider in the center of an invisible web. Empress Lian had survived 3 emperors, including her own husband, and countless purges. Those who knew her described a woman with eyes as soft as moonlit pools, yet capable of chilling calculation. She learned early that love in the palace was a currency, not a comfort. When assassins killed her brothers in the Year of Frost, she offered her loyalty to the victors. When her husband fell ill, she aligned herself with his fiercest rivals to preserve her son's claim. These choices etched lines into her face that powder could never hide. Prince Xiaowei, her only surviving child, grew up in a world where every gesture was performed beneath a tapestry of staring ancestors. He was a thin, beautiful boy with downcast eyes, raised more by the shrines of his forebears than by any human warmth. Courtiers learned to read his silences like scripture. A downturned glance might mean displeasure. A flicker of hesitation could doom a petition. Yet beneath his robes of yellow silk, Xiaowei's heart trembled like a rabbit's. He longed for the approval of the one person whose love always seemed a hair's breadth beyond reach: his mother. Historians debate whether Dowager Empress Lian's affections were ever genuine. Some argue she was a mother who adored her son, but was too warped by palace life to show it without poison. Others suggest she saw Xiaowei as a vessel for her legacy, a figure to control so her bloodline would endure. What is certain is that the boy grew up convinced that his survival, his very right to breathe, depended on performing loyalty so perfect it could never be questioned. It was Minister Ru Cheng, the Chancellor of State, who first sensed the opportunity lying coiled in this bond. According to court documents and chronicles by palace scribes, Ru Cheng was a master of ceremonies with a face like wet parchment and a voice smooth as oiled silk. He rose through the ranks by anticipating which way the storm would blow and offering his allegiance before thunder cracked. When enemies plotted to replace Empress Lian's line with a distant cousin, Ru Cheng devised a scheme so abhorrent it would forever bind mother and son, making any accusation of disloyalty unthinkable. Experts on dynastic politics observe that in the decaying years of old empires, the boundaries between ritual and horror often blur. The dynasty's strict codes demanded sons' honor, mothers above all, and loyalty was tested in ever more extreme ways as the court's paranoia deepened. So when Dowager Empress Lian invited her teenage heir to her bedchamber under the pretense of a midnight ritual of protection, the first seeds of an unthinkable act were sown, a moment when power, love, and fear braided themselves into an unbreakable knot. In the darkness of that night, with the winter winds clawing at the paper windows, a story began that would stain an entire empire in shame. A story of a prince who believed that to keep his mother's love and the throne, he must surrender every boundary of self. The night air inside the Eastern Palace's private quarters felt thick enough to choke on. Servants moved like ghosts, eyes lowered, bearing trays of jade cups filled with spiced wine and bowls of crushed lotus meant to lull the mind. Courtiers who dared linger beyond curfew were chased away by guards with eyes hard as obsidian. Only those closest to the Dowager Empress remained, forming a ring of shadows outside her lacquered doors, straining to hear a hint of what was unfolding inside. Prince Xiaowei had been summoned at midnight, a time believed by court astrologers to stand between the worlds of the living and the dead. He walked barefoot through the endless halls, guided only by dim lanterns that hissed with every gust seeping through cracked windows. Each step echoed with the unspoken truth. This was no ordinary mother-son meeting. Experts on ancient Eastern rituals have uncovered fragments of testimony suggesting that these late-night summons were used as loyalty tests during periods of succession crisis. A prince called to his mother's bedchamber at the witching hour would know in his bones that refusal was tantamount to treason. As Xiaowei paused before the final door, heart hammering, he could almost hear the whispers of his ancestors begging him to turn back. But behind him stood Minister Ru Cheng's trusted guards, their armor lacquered black to swallow light, ensuring there was only one way forward. Dowager Empress Lian waited inside, reclining on a couch of silk the color of spilled blood. Her perfume, cloying and sharp, overpowered the scent of the dying garden outside. Candles ringed the room, their flames bowing in the night's drafts like nervous courtiers. When Xiaowei entered, his mother did not rise. She studied him with eyes that flickered between hunger and sorrow. Historians believe these private moments, though rarely documented, held the key to understanding how a mother's love could be weaponized. At her side stood Minister Ru Cheng himself, his skeletal hands clasped in front of his robe, as if officiating a wedding no one dared name. According to accounts preserved in the diaries of junior eunuchs who overheard fragments of this night, the minister spoke first, his voice low and smooth, explaining that rivals at court had begun spreading rumors, that Xiao Wei was plotting with distant uncles, that he might betray his mother to seize the throne early. The accusations were invented, but they carried the scent of truth in a court accustomed to conspiracies. To silence these rumors, Ru Cheng declared, the prince must prove beyond doubt that he was utterly devoted to his mother, willing to cross any boundary for her. He spoke of ancient precedents, twisted half-legends of heirs who shared their mother's bed, to seal a bond so absolute it rendered betrayal impossible. The suggestion drifted through the candlelit room like a plague wind. In that moment, time seemed to warp. Dowager Empress Lian's gaze shifted from icy calculation to something almost gentle. She reached out with a hand adorned in jade rings, the same hand that had once rocked him to sleep during his night terrors as a child. The lullaby she used to hum returned to him unbidden, a memory of comfort now tainted by horror. Historians who have analyzed this dynasty's late rituals argue that the prince's psyche was primed for this moment. Years of conditional love, constant reminders of imperial duty, and the unrelenting fear of falling from favor had whittled his will into something fragile and pliable. Standing there, Xiaowei felt a storm of emotions tearing him apart. Revulsion, terror, love, and a desperate need for approval. At the threshold of his mother's bedchamber, with the dynasty's fate and his own life hanging in the silence, he stepped forward. The doors closed behind him with a hollow thud that sounded like the world sealing shut. In that instant, the prince who entered was not the same boy who would emerge. Dawn arrived gray and bitter over the Eastern Palace, cold light creeping across the polished floors like an uninvited guest. Outside the Empress's chambers, the few who knew what had transpired during the night stood silent, their faces blank as fresh parchment. Word had not yet spread, but an atmosphere of something rotten seeped from the walls, filling the corridors with dread. Even the palace dogs whined and slunk into corners. According to historians of imperial psychology, what happened next was just as crucial as the act itself. The transformation of a single night's violation into a permanent state of fear and dependence. Minister Ru Cheng understood this perfectly. At the first bell of morning, he summoned scribes to record an official statement that the prince had demonstrated his unshakable loyalty to his mother and the throne. Though veiled in euphemism, the proclamation left little doubt among those who could read between the lines. Any rival who questioned Xiaowei's devotion would now appear a traitor by default. The empress began parading her son through private audiences with influential nobles. Xiaowei, pale and hollow-eyed, was dressed in robes that had belonged to his father, thick brocades reeking of old incense, symbols of imperial power heavy on his thin shoulders. By her side, he was both trophy and shield, Observers noted how Empress Lian's touch lingered on his arm just a moment too long, how she watched him with an intensity that was neither purely maternal nor political. Experts in dynastic collapse point out that incestuous rumors, whether true or false, were often a prelude to violent purges. Within weeks, two cousins of the prince were executed for plots no one bothered to detail, their properties seized to finance new palace renovations. Ministers who had supported other lines of succession offered panicked gifts and alliances, knowing the court's center of gravity had shifted overnight. The boy who had once been pitied for his fragile constitution was now the axis around which terror spun. In the weeks following that night, Zhao Wei's mind unraveled in small, unseen ways. He began waking to nightmares of blood seeping from silken bedsheets, his mother's lullaby twisting into a discordant hum. Servants found him muttering to his reflection in polished bronze mirrors, searching his own eyes for traces of monstrousness. He would bathe obsessively, scrubbing his skin until it bled, only to sink back into the same poisoned rituals by nightfall. Minister Rao Chung ensured Xiao Wei's isolation deepened. The prince's childhood friends were reassigned to distant provinces or sent to military garrisons. His tutors were replaced by older scholars loyal to the empress. Even the food tasters, once men of moderate rank, were replaced with eunuchs who reported every flicker of the prince's mood. Within a month, Xiao Wei could not speak a word to another soul without his mother or Ru Chung learning of it by sundown. Archaeological findings from the palace site reveal layers of hurried renovations from this period. Hidden passageways walled up, new locks installed, doors repainted to hide scratches. They stand as mute testimony to the feverish paranoia that took root. The prince himself ordered the construction of a private shrine beside his bedchamber, a small altar where he left offerings of perfumed rice and ivory figurines. According to records, he prayed there nightly, begging faceless spirits for forgiveness he could not name aloud. Every day, Dowager Empress Lian and Minister Rucheng held court beside Xiao Wei, orchestrating a new reign of purges and decrees. Every night, the prince returned to the same dark bedchamber, where love and power had become indistinguishable, and silence was more terrifying than screams. On the eve of the midwinter festival, the palace was draped in banners of white and gold that fluttered like funeral shrouds in the icy wind. The river beyond the palace walls lay frozen and silent, reflecting a pale moon that seemed to hover watchfully over the city's fate. Musicians gathered in the outer courtyards to rehearse songs meant to celebrate the dynasty's endurance. But their trembling hands and glances over the shoulder betrayed a city teetering on the edge of collapse. According to experts on court rituals, midwinter was the most sacred night in the imperial calendar, a time to honor ancestors and reaffirm the mandate of heaven. But within the labyrinth of the Eastern Palace, this year's festival marked the moment Dowager Empress Lian and Minister Ru Chung would secure absolute power or watch everything crumble. That night, in the Hall of Ancestral Echoes, a feast was prepared that gleamed with roasted peacock, candied plums, and rare mushrooms from the empire's southern jungles. The prince sat beside his mother at the high table, his eyes dark hollows above feverish cheeks. He felt both exposed and untouchable, his very presence an unspoken threat to every rival in the hall. Minister Ru Cheng hovered near the shadows, his thin lips twitching with satisfaction. He knew the assembled officials dared not question the mother-son bond they all sensed but could never name aloud. When the final course was cleared, a hush fell. Empress Lian stood, lifted a jade cup of winter wine, and offered a toast. Her voice, once soft and musical, now rang with steely authority as she spoke of divine favor upon her family, of unity forged through trials only they could survive. Scholars of dynastic speeches note how cleverly she evoked the language of ancestral duty while never naming the true horror binding her to the prince, leaving every listener complicit in their silence. Then at her signal, two guards dragged a chained prisoner into the hall, a minor noble who had dared to suggest the prince was unfit for the throne. The man's eyes bulged with terror as he was forced to kneel on the jade tiles, his hair matted with blood from a beating suffered en route. Empress Lian gestured to her son, the moment stretching thin and brittle as glass. Minister Ru Cheng's voice slithered through the silence, urging the prince to demonstrate the resolve expected of a ruler destined to save a crumbling empire. Every breath in the hall waited on Xiao Wei's next move. He rose, legs trembling beneath ceremonial robes, heavy with embroidered dragons. He reached for the executioner's blade offered by a servant. The prisoner began to sob, wailing that he had only spoken out of love for the realm, words that splintered the frozen quiet like shattered ice. Historians describe what followed as the definitive breaking point of the prince's humanity. With a single motion, Zhao Wei slashed the prisoner's throat, blood arcing across the polished jade as the hall erupted in gasps, stifled almost as soon as they formed. The prince's hands, slick with crimson, trembled in the candlelight. But instead of retreating in horror, he stood frozen, eyes darting to his mother for approval. Empress Lian smiled, a slow, small smile that historians have called the most chilling gesture recorded in the final years of the dynasty. She stepped forward, cupped her son's stained hands in hers, and kissed his forehead before the stunned assembly. In that instant, every official understood. The boy who had been a frail heir was gone. In his place stood a prince who had sacrificed every boundary of decency, driven by a love so corrupted it had become an instrument of terror. Outside, snow began to fall, drifting in slow, silent spirals that covered the palace roofs like a shroud. The festival music resumed, thin and discordant beneath the dark sky. And somewhere deep in the prince's chambers, the lonely altar to faceless spirits waited for prayers that would never bring peace. By the New Year's first dawn, word of the midwinter execution swept through the palace like a bitter wind. Servants avoided the prince's gaze, scuttling along walls as if his shadow alone could stain them. Ministers who had once schemed for alternate heirs now knelt so deeply their foreheads bruised on cold stone, offering silk-wrapped tributes and tearful pledges of loyalty. The Eastern Palace became quieter than ever, its grand halls ringing with the absence of any dissent. According to historians of late dynastic power, such moments of enforced unity always masked deeper cracks. Behind the obedience lay simmering dread. Every official who witnessed the prince's transformation understood that nothing, no ritual, no oath, no prayer, could cleanse the corruption unveiled that night. The empress and her son had crossed an unspoken line, one that left the entire realm adrift in moral fog. Inside his private chambers, Prince Xiaowei fell into a cycle of waking nightmares. Servants reported hearing him cry out to ghosts of executed cousins, to the murdered noble whose blood still soaked his dreams. He grew gaunt, cheeks hollowing beneath dark eyes that flickered with sudden rages. Some nights he tore tapestries from the walls in a frenzy, shrieking for silence. Other nights he stood motionless for hours, fingers tracing the ridges of his face as though searching for the boy who had existed before that first midnight summons. Meanwhile, Empress Lian and Minister Ru Cheng consolidated power with ruthless efficiency. Lists of enemies appeared overnight. Arrests and executions became a daily fact of court life. Food tasters sampled every dish. Visitors underwent invasive searches. Letters from the provinces were burned unopened if they smelled of sedition. In council meetings, Empress Lian often held her son's hand before the gathered ministers, a silent reminder of who truly ruled, and how far she was willing to go to keep it that way. Archaeological discoveries from the palace foundations have uncovered strange symbols etched into hidden doorways and walls from this period. Experts believe they were talismans placed by servants desperate to ward off what they called the rot of the bloodline, a fear that something unnatural had settled into the marrow of the royal family, poisoning everyone it touched. In those final months, the prince's health deteriorated rapidly. He coughed blood into embroidered handkerchiefs, and his once delicate features hardened into a mask of perpetual suspicion. During official audiences, he would pause mid-sentence, staring off as if seeing some vision others could not. Ministers learned to sit frozen during these episodes, terrified that the wrong movement might snap him back into sudden, murderous lucidity. And always, Dowager Empress Lian remained by his side, her hand light on his arm, her eyes glittering with fierce possessiveness. She comforted him with the same lullabies she once used when he was a feverish child, melodies that now sounded like dirges. Historians suggest that by this point, the Empress no longer trusted anyone but her son, and he, stripped of every boundary and friend, clung to her as the only reality left. But beyond the palace walls, rumors of their corruption multiplied. Rebellions simmered in distant provinces. Neighboring kingdoms watched with eager malice, waiting for the moment the empire would collapse under the weight of its own horror. The boy who had been meant to secure the dynasty's future had become the fuse to its inevitable destruction. After the prince's final public appearance, a festival where he appeared so gaunt and hollow-eyed that rumors spread he was already dead, the Eastern dynasty's decline accelerated beyond anyone's control. Snow melted into spring rains that washed through the palace gardens, but nothing could cleanse the rot festering in the heart of the empire. The boy who had once been a fragile symbol of hope now haunted every corridor like a living ghost, and courtiers began to speak his name only in terrified whispers. According to historians who studied court chronicles and exile letters, Empress Lian's iron grip grew more erratic as her son's health failed. Some days she appeared at councils with radiant confidence, issuing decrees of unprecedented cruelty. Other days she retreated to her chambers for weeks, wailing like a mother mourning a child not yet dead. Minister Ru Cheng kept the machinery of terror grinding on, but cracks spread through his networks of informants as officials realized the dynasty's days were numbered. By the end of that summer, several provincial governors openly refused to send taxes or troops. Pirate lords seized river cities. Bands of rebels calling themselves the Sons of the True Dragon sacked supply depots within 50 miles of the capital. Each day brought new petitions, new demands, new insults to the authority of a regime that had once inspired awe. But inside the palace, the empress and her dying son seemed oblivious, their world shrinking to the darkened halls where they clung to each other, bound by a love too poisoned to ever let go. When Prince Xiaowei finally succumbed, historians believe, to a fever born of weakened lungs and a mind exhausted by endless fear, he died in his mother's bedchamber. The Dowager Empress was said to have cradled him until his body went cold, crooning the same lullaby that had once promised safety, the same song that had become a curse. Within days, Empress Lian herself disappeared from records. Some believe she took poison at his funeral. Others claim palace guards smuggled her away in a litter to a hidden monastery where she lived out her days whispering to shadows. Minister Ruching did not live long enough to secure a new puppet. Rival ministers stormed the palace within a month, cutting him down in the council chamber. Rebels breached the capital's walls soon after, and the palace that had once been the heart of an empire burned for 3 days, its lacquered beams cracking in showers of sparks. The dynasty collapsed in a storm of vengeance and confusion, and the boy prince's story was almost lost to ash and time. But scraps survived: letters from terrified servants, memoirs of exiled ministers, fragments of songs sung in distant villages about the prince who slept with his mother. These remnants, scattered across centuries, remain a testament to how power can twist love into something monstrous, and how an empire can fall not through swords alone, but through wounds carved deep in the quietest rooms of its own palace. Modern historians remind us that the tragedy of Prince Xiaowei is more than a cautionary tale of royal excess. It is a window into the human heart, showing how fear and longing can be woven into cages no less cruel than iron bars. It is a reminder that every grand tapestry of history is stitched from individual lives, fragile, desperate, and capable of both unfathomable tenderness and unfathomable horror. So as we walk away from these ruined halls in our minds, let us carry with us not just the spectacle of an empire's fall, but the haunting truth of a child who was taught that to be loved, he must destroy himself. For in remembering him, we remember the cost of power unbound by compassion, a lesson as vital today as it was in the final days of the Eastern Dynasty.